Welcome everyone to today's webinar, which is Meeting the Respite Needs of Grandfamilies and Relative Caregivers. For those of you who don't know, my name is Jill Kagan, and I'm the Program Director of the ARCH National Respite Network and Resource Center. ARCH houses the Lifespan Respite Technical Assistance Center with funding from the Administration for Community Living. Through this initiative and through the general work we do at the Resource Center, we provide training and technical assistance to state lifespan respite grantees, their partners, including state respite coalitions, to national, state, and community-based organizations that are wanting to improve the quality of and access to respite services for all family caregivers. Through our National Respite Locator Service and by linking to state lifespan respite databases and programs, we also assist family caregivers in finding and accessing respite services and funding sources. I did want to mention that the call for presentations to the 2016 National Lifespan Respite Conference is now open. The deadline for submitting a proposal to present a breakout session at the conference is March 21st. The conference is going to be held in Denver, Colorado, September 20th through the 22nd, followed by the Lifespan Respite Grantee and Partner Learning Symposium on September 23rd. And I want to express our appreciation to our co-hosts for this event, the Colorado Respite Coalition, Easter Seals of Colorado, the National MS Society Colorado-Wyoming Chapter, and the Colorado Department of Human Services. So if you think you'd like to present at the conference, you can get more information at our website. And I think you can see our website address there on the screen, archrespite.org. And you can link to the conference website from there. In the chat box that some people are having problems hearing today. I'm going to proceed, but I'll leave that to Emily to see if she can try to resolve that with those of you that are having some problems. Unless you know
those that are having problems, will we be able to get the email to connect to get updates as well?
You mean in terms of the archived webinar?
Yes.
Link? Mm-hmm. Yes, everyone who's attending today, if you've registered and we have your email address, you will receive a link to the archived
webinar.
Great,
thank you. Because you're going in and out on me. I don't know, maybe the weather here.
Yeah, the weather is also very bad on the East Coast today and might get worse as we progress. So if we have technical difficulties, it may be due to that, and I apologize.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm. One of ARCH's ongoing and primary objectives, especially this year and in the next couple of years, is to really work to assure that our lifespan respite grantees and our state respite coalition affiliates are working with a broad range of stakeholders from across the age and disability spectrum, and to help them identify populations who may be unserved or underserved, and also work with them to provide guidance on developing paths to new and innovative respite options to meet the special needs of these unserved populations. Grandparents and relative caregivers certainly fall into this group, which is why we've included them, and we're delighted to be able to talk about this population today. Several years ago, we did partner with Generations United to develop a fact sheet specifically on respite for grandfamilies that has been very popular and I hope useful to all of you in your work as well. And you can actually download that fact sheet directly from the webinar platform under the area where it says materials that Emily pointed out. The fact sheet is listed there, as well as the PowerPoint slides for today and Generation United's Grandfamilies report that our speaker is going to be talking about today. Our collaboration with Generations United has been ongoing, and Jaia Lent, our first speaker, has been a member of the Arch Advisory Committee since its inception in 2009. And I'm really delighted to welcome her today to share the findings from their very recent study on the state of grandfamilies in America. Jaia is the Deputy Executive Director at Generations United, which, if you're not familiar with it, is a national membership organization that's focused on promoting intergenerational public policies, strategies, and programs. Jaia provides direction for the National Center on Grandfamilies, which is a leading voice for issues affecting families headed by grandparents or other relatives. Under her leadership, legislation has passed to help grandfamilies in areas ranging from housing to family caregiving and child welfare. Through the National Center on Grandfamilies, Jaia leads an effort to set a unified agenda and coordinate the work of national organizations who are serving and advocating for grandfamilies. And she also oversees the center's work to provide technical assistance to states on a broad range of kinship issues. I'm also very pleased to introduce Matt Kaplan. He is the Professor of Intergenerational Programs and Aging in the Department of Agricultural Economics, Sociology, and Education at Penn State University. In this position, he conducts research, develops curricular resources, and provides statewide leadership in the development and evaluation of intergenerational programs. At the core of his research and outreach initiatives is the Penn State Intergenerational Program, which is rooted in Penn State Extension, but includes a broad base of scholars and practitioners. Matt did partner in the preparation of his presentation with Melinda Perez-Porter, who I wanted to mention, but who unfortunately could not be with us today. I'm honored that Melinda has recently become a member of the Arch Advisory Committee also. She is the director of the Brookdale Foundation Group's Relatives as Parents program. It's another very important resource for all of you, so I wanted to be sure to mention it. RAP began in 1996 to create or expand support groups and other direct services to grandparents and other relative caregivers. As Emily mentioned, and you've already become familiar with, you can enter your questions or comments at any time in the chat box on the lower right portion of your screen. And we're not going to pause to respond to them, however, until after Jaia has completed her remarks, and then again after Matt's presentation. So again, thank you, Jaia and Matt, for agreeing to present today. We're really delighted to have both of you. And I am now going to turn it over to Jaia to begin her presentation.
Great. Thank you, Jill, and thank you for having me and for all that are tuning into this for the good work that you do for family caregivers. Looks like I'm not successfully moving there we go, moving the slides forward. Terrific. So just a little bit about what I plan to cover today. We're going to start with some of the numbers of grandfamilies, as we call them, any family where a grandparent or another relative is raising a child. Talk a little bit about how both the children and grandparents in those families are doing, their well-being, walk through some of the challenges that they're facing, then talk about some specific supportive policies that we examined as part of our State of Grandfamilies report, then talk about supportive services that follow out of those policies, and then tune into some specific respite examples from there. So we will start by focusing in on the children in grandfamilies. So if you look at the chart in front of you, and as Jill mentioned that to the side of your screen you can actually open the full report if you're interested in looking at the report in the full context as I'm talking, but this chart was pulled out of that report. But if you start looking at this chart to the right, you'll see that sort of turquoise colored circle, the 402 some thousand children. Those are the number of children that were in foster care and sort of the most recent data set that we had at the time, which is 2013. So of all the 402,000 children in foster care, if you move over to that middle number, about 28% of those children are raised in grandfamilies or kinship care. So they're being raised by grandparents or other relatives. That means that they have gone through the formal training that's connected with foster care. They've gone through the licensing procedure, which is often extensive to get their home up to a certain code. The advantage of that is that they then generally, in most cases, get the financial support that comes with a traditional foster parent, so they get that payment to be used to care for the child. And it also means that they will have a social worker that would help connect them to supports and services. Now, if you go to the left part of the screen to that larger green circle, at the 2.5 million children, only the ones that are outside of that little intersection are the vast majority of children that are being raised by grandparents and other relatives. So the vast majority are being raised outside of the formal foster care system. And that's particularly important because it means that they are much less likely to be connected to supports and services. They don't have a social worker saying, here's a place that you can go for this or for that. They're sort of out more on their own trying to connect with whatever community supports are available. So often in conversations, people think that these families are, going through the licensing foster connected to the child welfare system. Vast majority are not, making those community-based supports even more important. Now, just to talk a little bit about where these numbers have been going, the number of children in foster care had been going down over years, but actually in 2014 and 2015, the following reports that we'll be putting out in future years, we're going to see that that number is starting to pick up a little bit. On the other hand, as the numbers of children in foster care have been going down, the number of children placed with relatives when they are placed in foster care is going up. So the foster care system is doing better at prioritizing placements with relatives whenever possible. However, the numbers of children that are outside of the foster care system altogether continue to be significant. They've been relatively steady, but they continue to be significant numbers outside of the system. What this does not capture, so you'll see the heading of this is children and grandfamilies, no parent in the home. So this captures those situations where we are confident that a grandparent or another relative is providing full-time care raising that child. However, there's also a data set that says that 7.8 children are living in a house that's headed by a grandparent or another relative. So that means that the relative is the homeowner or the head of the household. There may or may not be a parent there, so they may be playing a role in raising that child, but we don't know. That would also include multi-generational families and different type of family arrangements. So if you ever see the 7.8 million number, that much larger number, that probably includes some families where the grandparent is raising the grandchild as well, but it means that there may be a parent in and out of the household. So when people ask how many children are actually being raised in grandfamilies, the true answer is that we don't know. The number is probably somewhere between 2.5 million and 7.8 million. It just depends on, whether or not you want to count the situations where parents are present or not. So what does that look like in terms of a state-by-state breakdown? What you have here is the state chart. The lighter colored are states that have higher numbers of grandfamilies being raised, or children being raised in grandfamilies with no parent present. These numbers are all with no parent in the home through grandfamilies. And you'll see that while we have some higher numbers in the South, that certainly this is a phenomenon that cuts across, there's a lot of geographic diversity here. It's in the South, it's in the North, it's in the Midwest, it's in the East Coast, the West Coast. It's in rural areas, it's in urban areas. So it's not something that only affects certain parts of the country. It happens across the nation. That's just a snapshot of the children. We'll move next to the grandparents. The big universe of grandparents would be that we know that about 1 in 10 grandparents live with their grandchildren, but But that doesn't necessarily mean that they're playing a role in raising the grandchild. It just means they see them on a regular basis. The census asks the question of grandparents, are you responsible for your grandchildren? So that's a self-report. If they say they're responsible, they show up in this piece. So in many of those situations, that means that they are raising the grandchildren. The latest data says 2.6 million of grandparents are responsible for their grandchildren. A little bit about what we know about them. The majority of them are in the workforce, but there are many that aren't. And certainly anecdotally and from research, we know that for some, they were working, and then once the grandchild comes into their life, they have to stop. For others, they weren't working, and once the grandchild comes into their life, they have to start. But where it sort of comes out in the end is about 58% of them are in the workforce. 21% of them live below the poverty line. There was a report that came out recently from a campaign to end senior hunger that actually showed that the presence of the grandchild was one of the predictive factors of hunger in seniors. So we know that many of them are struggling with poverty. 26% of them have a disability, and when I get more deeply into some of the well-being data, we'll talk about how that child entering their life affects their ability to care for themselves. And 42% of them have been providing care for 5 years or more. So what we know is that often the families are stepping into this, expecting it to be a temporary situation, but before they know it, they've had these kids for extended periods of time. And finally, 39% of them are over 60, so it's not an insignificant number that are older, but there's also very, very large numbers of younger grandparents. So let's get into a little more detail on their well-being. First, the children. Children that are living with grandfamilies are much more likely to live in poverty. Sorry, I was hearing a little echo, so I was picking up the phone. About 1 in 4 compared to children living with parents, and the number for children with parents is about 1 in 5. These families, when the children enter relative care, they most likely or absolutely have experienced some sort of trauma related to parental separation at some time. And at times it may be abuse or neglect. The parent may be deceased. They may be just disconnected because of drug involvement, mental health issues. There's a whole range of reasons, but there is some sort of trauma related to separation. And they usually enter the arrangement with some sort of emotional, behavioral, mental health, or physical challenges. So families are stepping into a role and caring for kids that come with a whole series of challenges, hence the need for a break and respite from time to time. But what's important to know is despite entering these situations with a whole set of challenges, children do well with relatives. Of course, in our other work, we're always advocating for prioritizing placing children with relatives whenever possible instead of non-related people, because we know that when children are placed with relatives compared to those placed with non-relatives, they have more stability, they're more likely to maintain connections with brothers and sisters, and preserve their cultural heritage. And research actually shows that over time that those children with relatives compared to those in foster care with non-relatives are less likely to have ongoing psychiatric problems or behavioral issues. And the grandparents. So as I mentioned earlier, while these grandparents often unexpectedly step into the role of caring for their grandchildren. Sometimes it comes in the middle of the night. They get a phone call and say, take the kids, or the alternative would be foster care. So they weren't planning on this. They're not spending a lot of time preparing to become a foster parent as a traditional foster parent would. It's often unexpected, and so all of a sudden all of their attention is focused on the child, and like in many family caregiving situations, they often ignore their own health needs in order to focus on those of the children that they're caring for. When you compare grandparents not living with their children to grandparents that are raising their grandchildren. They are more likely, the grandparents raising grandchildren are more likely to live in poverty, as I mentioned, be working part-time, be disabled, face the threat of hunger, and experience certain health and mental health issues such as chronic stress, depression, and hypertension. So that's some on the well-being. Speaking just a little bit more to the challenges that they face when they step into this role. As I mentioned, this is often usually something that comes unexpectedly. It takes a major hit on the financial situation. You often have families that were saving for retirement, and all of a sudden the retirement gets cashed in to pay for the needs of the children, or it gets switched to saving for college instead. So major financial hit, as this was not something that they were planning for. I think we spoke to some of the mental and physical health challenges for both the children and the caregivers themselves. Legal issues is a big, big deal. In addition to trying to take on this new caregiving role, many of these families may be struggling with legal issues. It may be that they're trying to get custody so they can do some simple things like enroll the children in school, consent to medical care for the kids, and other sort of legal decision-making authority for the children. For some, it's just a matter of, knowing what to do to fill out the basic paperwork and go through the process. In other situations, there may be parents that are contesting this arrangement, so it can be a very exhaustive, years and years long process to secure custody of the child that's going to allow them to provide for the child in the way that they need to and provide stability and assurance for that child. Housing. We do have many cases where grandparents are living in housing that's designated for seniors, and in some cases where children aren't allowed, in other cases where the accommodations just aren't the best for children, and so they're looking for other places to live. So that is a challenge. Social isolation, particularly families that were planning or families were in certain social circles, and all of a sudden, they were with their older adult friends doing things that other older adults wanted to do, and now they're going to play dates and school functions and find themselves very separated from their previous social cycle. So that's a challenge, just feeling separate and needing to create a whole new group of friends and connections that can be supportive of them and that they can support in a unique way. Poor access to information. I mentioned the vast majority are outside of the system, so they're less likely to be connected to a social support or a social worker that can connect them to other services. So there's some marvelous things out there called kinship navigators, which I'll talk to next, that can address that. Childcare, if they are all of a sudden going back to work, they're learning about what childcare options are out there, and things have changed often, particularly for grandparents who haven't been caring for children in a long time. So accessing childcare, and it's very expensive, can be a huge issue. And finally, of course, respite, which is what we are going to be talking about at the end of this session. So next, the State of Grandfamilies report. As Jill mentioned, we just released in December a report on State of Grandfamilies in the U.S. This is our second annual report. This, in addition to providing the updates on the latest numbers of grandfamilies across the country, this year we actually evaluated all 50 states on a number of criteria. What we did was we examined whether or not states had any of 7 policy criteria that I'll talk through, and we also looked at 1 outcome measure for the families. I've particularly highlighted on this slide 2 of the policy criteria that I thought would be perhaps of most interest to this group, and that is whether or not they have a lifespan respite program and whether they use nearly at least the full amount of their National Family Caregiver Support Program dollars to serve grandfamilies. So those were 2 of the measures. In addition to that, we looked at whether or not states had things called educational consent laws and healthcare consent laws, which are laws that give families that don't have legal custody of those children the authority to enroll them in school or consent to their medical care. We also looked at something called de facto custody, and for those of you that are looking at the full report, this information is on page 8. I wasn't able to capture it in a readable way in a slide, but you can reference it there. In addition to that, we looked at whether or not a state had de facto custody, and that is a law that gives them a certain level of legal standing in court if the parent is contesting the custody of the child. We also looked at whether or not they had a guardianship assistance program, which is a supportive program that is that states can pick up where they get federal reimbursement to essentially give parents, grandparents, some payment for children that come to them out of foster care settings. And then finally, the National Family Caregiver Support Program, whether they use at least 9% of those funds, allowable funds. States can use up to 10% of those funds to serve grand families. So we looked at if states were using up to almost the full amount of that money to serve those families. So those were the 7 policy criteria that we used. And then in addition to that, we used one outcome measure, and that is what percent of children in foster care were being raised in grand families. So it's how high that middle number is in that Venn diagram that I showed you at the beginning of this presentation. So those were our criteria. The reason that we selected those criteria is we were looking at criteria that would really be supportive of grand families both inside and outside of the system. We looked at policies that really specifically speak to this population. We recognize that, of course, the degree to which basic housing resources are available for low-income families, the way that SNAP policies or sort of food stamp policies are implemented in the state, healthcare, all of those things absolutely affect grand families as well. But we were trying to look specifically at policies that really speak specifically to this population. So with the use of those measures, we came to some conclusions. Well, I should also say that we really looked at whether or not these states had these policies. What we would love to do and did not do, or were not able to do with this particular report, is really evaluate the degree to which these policies are being used and fully implemented. So that's an important disclaimer for the way these states were evaluated. In addition to that, we didn't look at every program innovation that is available in the state to help grand families. We really just looked at those policies, whether that they exist, and that one outcome measure. So instead, we highlighted some program innovations, but we weren't able to do a full evaluation of, all the programs in every state for grand families. So with that background and understanding, what were a couple of the key findings? First of all states that we looked at had at least one of the grand family friendly policy measures. No state scored 100%, so every state has something that they could be improving. On average, we know that states are doing a better job placing children with relatives when they must enter foster care. So how did states come out? These are the top 10 states that made our list. I believe they are actually ranked in order in terms of how they scored on our criteria. But even within the top 10 states, only these 4 technically received a passing grade if you used our criteria and turned it into a percentage format. So we know that states do certainly have a long way to go. Important piece to recognize here is, as I mentioned, the existence of a lifespan respite program was one of the criteria, but only one of the criteria. So if you're on this call from a certain state and you're in a state that does very well at serving grand families with your respite program, but you're not in the top 10 state, that could be the case. It probably is that your state does not do as well in some of the other criteria, even though you're doing well in respite, and vice versa. If you're on here, but you feel like your state is not doing a good job in terms of respite and grand families, that could be the case because your state is doing well in other areas. So those are the highlights from our report. And so what does it mean? Well, we have a series of recommendations in the report that aren't all specific to respite care, so I didn't want to go through them in detail. But I think the most important piece here, big concern for grand families in terms of supportive services, is that there are much more services for those families that are inside the formal foster care system, have become licensed foster parents, than there are those outside of the formal foster care system. And that's where, of course, your networks, the making lifespan respite available to families regardless of their connection with the child welfare system, is really important. So the types of supportive services that we recommend are, of course, support groups, making them available whenever possible, and the support group itself can really serve as a type of respite for families. Kinship navigator services are services that, in a way, this is sort of an intensive information and referral, a one-stop shop where families can contact a warm line or a help desk to get information about what resources and services could be made available to them. If your state has one of those, it's very important to be connected with it to make sure that they are aware of what respite services are available in the community, and they can be communicating that to those calling. Whether or not that is their presenting need, often families need that, so they might be calling a navigator asking for legal help, and a skilled navigator would dig a little bit more deeply and find the full sets of needs that the family's presenting with, and may end up coming off the call with saying, not only is legal needed, but in addition to that, this kind of respite service could be a real resource to the family. Legal services, a number of states have things anywhere from legal guides to legal clinics that families can come to once a month, to more intensive services to really help those families sort through their legal challenges and perhaps get legal custody of the children if that's what they're pursuing. Grand Families Housing, there's some very innovative housing programs available in pockets of the country where housing has been designed specifically for grandparents raising grandchildren. They have on-site sites and services for both the grand family caregivers and the children. And there's a program like that highlighted in our report if you're interested in having more detailed information. And training. Training for grand families is often coupled with support groups. There can be opportunities to bring in speakers, have conversations, learning in that way. Other families do sometimes get access to some of the training that traditional foster parents can get access to. There's some real innovative programs beginning to do more training, making more training available to grand families around trauma and trauma's impact on the brain, and how that will impact outcomes of children in their care. And then next, of course, the importance of respite care. So just a little bit about supporting grand families' respite programs. This information has actually come from Melinda Perez-Porter from the Brookdale Foundation. When she wasn't able to join this call, she just sent along some of her tips that she's found as she's supported support groups and other organizations supporting respite for grand families across the country. A couple of key federal sources, of course, is the Lifespan Respite Act provides some support for respite. And then in addition to that, I'm sure many of you know that the Federal National Family Caregiver Support Program has funds that have 5 types of services that they can be used to offer, and respite care is one of them. Up to 10% of those dollars can be used to serve grand families if your state so chooses. In addition to that, some child welfare funding, the Promoting Safe and Stable Families Act, may have some resources that can be used for that purpose. There is a movement on the federal level. There's a lot of discussion right now about some proposed legislation that would put forward some more preventative dollars to help keep kids out of foster care. And depending on how that turns out, there may be some more funds in that area that would be flexible, that could maybe be tapped into for services like respite care. But that's just in discussions right now. Just wanted to give a heads up of that possibility. Next, private funding resources. Here, of course, the private and community foundations, civic clubs have often been a helpful resource to local community groups in serving grand families. And then donations from alumni, and by that I mean, caregivers that raised their grandchildren and are not any longer wanting to continue to find a way to give and support this community, or successful people that were raised by their grandparents, really looking for ways to give back and as a way to honor the work that their grandparents have done. And then finally, the importance of collaborations to provide respite in perhaps some non-traditional ways through parks and recreation services. Cooperative extension programs, of course, as Matt will be representing, is an excellent resource so often for respite programs. Simple community sources like bowling alleys, museums, pizza parlors, movie theaters. And then certainly those Big Brothers and Big Sisters programs and community-based programs like Girls and Boy Scouts. And then Melinda certainly highlighted one of her favorite illustrations was a service fraternity that did some initial fundraising for them and now on a regular basis is connected with supporting a local Grand Families program that provides some respite care in one of the communities that she works with. So finally, just a few more specific examples. I won't spend too much time on this because this is really Matt's territory. But when you look at what different states are doing, Melinda sent just a list of some of the report from a survey that came back, and these are some of the real common types of respite provided to grand families. I think what's really important to recognize when we're thinking about providing service to this population, respite to this population in particular, is often the caregivers are very aware that these children have very often gone through some real trauma related to separation, so there's some real hesitancy for them to then leave kids with another caregiver. So respite opportunities where grandparents can have a break from caregiving but can be close and can have the comfort of knowing that they can get to the child and the child can get to them very easily are really important to have that mix of that kind of respite instead of just leaving with someone and stepping away. So things like field trips to museum, these sort of short things can happen in addition to overnight trips when you really want more of a separation. Camp scholarships are helpful. After-school activities from tutoring, sports, games, and those kinds of examples are things where you can also have some parallel programming on site for the caregivers. Similarly with support groups, a support group for a caregiver that can have some parallel programming for a couple of hours designated for the children or child care. And similarly with family fun nights, there's activities for all that have some separate activities for the children and some optional separate activities for the caregivers. So just a snapshot of some ideas. I'm going to then turn it to questions, and then we'll move into Matt for the real concrete examples of how it works.
Great. Thank you so much, Jaia, for that really excellent presentation. There's so much information, important information that you've shared, and thank you also for being such a wonderful national voice for kinship caregivers. We're so lucky to have you as their advocates. And also thank you for giving states credit for applying and receiving their lifespan respite grants in an attempt to be as inclusive as possible in reaching all families with their respite dollars. Let's see if we have any questions. We have a question. Let's see, from Linda Porter, I believe this question is, consider the implications of children who have PTSD and other anxiety issues and behavior issues. Many of those on the slide, common respite, are not viable options for children with these special needs. Is that something you'd want to comment on, Jaia? We can also let Matt comment on that later.
I'm not sure I know what the question is. The question is, what types of respite are best for these families?
Well, I think what she's implying is that it's very difficult to provide trained providers sufficient to deal with behavioral and anxiety issues. And they might be very common among children who are living in grandparent families. And have there been any special efforts that you know of to deal with these special needs? And Linda, if I'm not stating that correctly, please retype your question.
Yeah, no, I think that absolutely is a challenge. I'm interested in if Matt has comment on that. I think that's part of the reason that we see that sometimes these families are looking for situations where they can stay close, to be available to respond if there's a flare-up. But the hard stop, I'm going away, for several hours and leaving the child separate can be more of a challenge. I would say that in some cases there can be partnerships with the child welfare agency and a need to do more advocacy with the child welfare agency to find what resources they have available to see if partnerships can be done with those trained professionals to access that type of support. There's certainly a movement in the therapeutic foster care arena to make that type of service available more broadly to these families. And for those that might not be familiar with therapeutic foster care, that is that the foster care providers are trained professionals that are familiar with the many challenges that children entering foster care face. So they have a very high level of training and are able to provide for care for a range of challenges that children come to. So that's going to take some real special communication and planning, because those families are really trained traditionally for those that are inside the foster care system. But I think doing some special outreach and relationships with the agency that's providing that care could be an innovative approach, because many of those therapeutic foster care providers are not the county or the state agency. They're a private agency that contracts with the county or the state.
Well, that's really a wonderful suggestion, Jaia. In fact, Phyllis Stevenson, who is a longtime member of our ARCH network and ran and facilitated the North Carolina Respite Coalition for many years, is now a national spokesperson on therapeutic foster care. And I'm certain she'd be, and definitely makes the connection between respite and therapeutic foster care, especially for these very special needs kids. So she would be an excellent resource for all of us as well. Anyone?
Yeah,
go ahead.
I was just going to say that movement, the therapeutic foster care movement, is just starting to catch an understanding of kinship care. They're starting to do training specifically with kinship families so that they have the therapeutic training. So I think that there's sort of a unique opening that's starting to evolve just in the last couple of years.
Yeah, that's very encouraging. Any other questions for Jaia? Okay, then we will move on to Matt. Matt, please go ahead.
Okay, hello everybody. I guess you can't be heard, but I assume you said hello. So here I am in the middle of Pennsylvania. It's bad weather, like it is in most of this part of the country. Thank you, Jill, for inviting us to make it, and Melinda sends her regrets for not being able to make it. However, we did talk, I guess, over many years, so I will try to throw in her perspective here and there and mention her resources. And it's good to be sharing the platform with Jaia, because she's been doing this for so many years, so I'm more of a newcomer. At any rate, yes, I'm going to be talking about intervention the intervention side of things, and it's wonderful that Jaia gave such a thorough background. In particular, I will be focusing in on support groups and retreats. So two categories of program interventions, and each of them kind of speaks to some of the, some of the effective strategies out there for supporting these families, these grandfamilies or grandparents and other relatives raising children. Also, let me just mention about Melinda's piece. I'm so happy that she's on the ARCH Advisory Board, because the RAP network run by Brookdale Foundation is wonderful. I mean, they do statewide conferences, regional conferences, funding, all kinds of technical support. So through the RAPs, or these relative as parent programs throughout the country, there's so much innovation in terms of supporting these families. Many of them do support groups and so on, which is one reason we're going to talk about that. Okay, so let me see. I guess besides retreats, I'm going to talk about some activities kind of taken from the intergenerational studies field, which can really be integrated into any kind of setting where you have kinship care families or grandfamilies, as well as other families dealing with caregiving issues. Okay, so just to move on here. Right, so as Jaia mentioned, I mean, many of these families are struggling. She didn't mention the 4 Ds, which is a really good way to remember a lot of research about how these families end up with missing a generation in the middle, caring for the children. So the 4 Ds, I think, there may be 5 Ds now, correct me if I'm wrong, Jaia, but I think it's death, desertion, drugs, detention, divorce, and I don't know if you could count AIDS. That has a D in it. That may be number 6. But you'll notice none of these Ds are happy reasons. So when a family ends up in this situation, a lot of times it is sudden. Could be in the middle of the night. And the challenge is really not just rebuilding the family, but creating a family identity, creating a family tradition, creating a family unit. So you have people coming together. The youth, in many cases, are traumatized. In many cases, as Linda Porter mentioned, having severe difficulties themselves, some psychiatric problems as well. So it's such a gray area in terms of how it falls between the cracks in terms of service systems. So it's so important that we talk about being creative in partnerships and coalition buildings to build up supports for these families. Okay, so when you're building a family, a really key theme is becoming more aware, helping them to understand each other's perspectives. So once you start working with these families and hearing stories, I mean, you hear really difficult behaviors in terms of people stomping out, people not cooperating, behavioral issues, neglect issues, anger issues, poor parenting strategies, and so on. So a lot of times a basic parenting skills training and listening skills on the part of children, understanding how discipline works, a lot of those basic elements of intervention really can be woven in to these programs I'm going to be speaking about. And the need for mutual support is so key. When I start talking about kinship, like weekend retreats, a lot of the activities are focused on having them learn together, and then look at the family unit and understand how their relationships are unfolding, how they can make a go of it, so that all of them can survive and thrive, and the family can emerge as a support system, and I guess amplify the resources and supports that are available. All right, so some of the work on support groups, I guess one of my first introductions to it was reading Melinda Perez Porter's fact sheet on support groups. Many of the RAPs have support groups. In my mind, This is probably the coin of the realm of work, groundwork in the neighborhoods, in these communities where these families are. Support group is kind of a beginning. So in many cases, they meet like once a month. There's a self-help component, and then they also have partnerships with human service agencies, educators, and so on. People come in and do some kind of a presentation, giving people sometimes legal information. So it's half, people supporting each other, half technical assistance and so on, and activities. But I'm just going to talk about some of what's written about support groups that do very well, and some of the things that have been found out. So the first point is about the name. So Melinda's paper and some other people who study these things, there's a lot of attention to the phrase support group, and personally, I think that's a fine phrase. We all need support. But apparently, a lot of people associate it with some sort of a stigma. So in response to that concern, people come up with names like Chat and Choose, Coffee and Conversation Group, Family Fun Night, and so on. So again, just dealing with these types of families according to where they're at and what their concerns are, what would bring them to join, what would bring them to want to show up. It's not only the name of it, it's also where they meet. There are certain agencies that some of these families fear. Some of the caregivers are worried that they would lose custody or care of their children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren. So it's not written here, but like a neutral meeting place is really good as well, where they could feel like they could just share what's really going on. The self-help component should never be underestimated, and it's very powerful. You hear some of the families that have been doing this for a long time, they don't only get good at understanding how to make it work as a family, but they're kind of experts in working the system and even educating like the professionals that are out there to help them. They tell each other what are the good agencies to work with, good people to ask for, good times to go and ask for help. They do a lot of networking in terms of like how do you get free legal services. Like on paper, yes, it should be there somewhere. But when you actually try making phone calls, it ends up your call gets transferred like to some conference room somewhere, nobody even answering. So there's so much to learn from the experience of other people who have been through it, and people really appreciate that. There is some research saying that just to leave it as a self-help entity research on support groups, it has pros, but it also has some cons, because sometimes people really do need professional opinion on issues in terms of like physical and mental health and what's considered legitimate concerns for taking legal action. You need professional opinions on different things. So inviting these presenters to come in and do these short talks kind of fits in really well. To get people to show up, some of the really good support groups, they've gotten very sophisticated. They get partners who donate things like meals and gift cards, and that makes it a lot more fun. And then some people can't show up because they have young children or youth, older children who they don't want to leave alone, and they already feel like they're, not doing enough perhaps. So, there's some organizations that provide childcare and some, volunteer groups that will do that. So bringing children there is really key, and also you could even have these, have the time the kids can have their own time, but also the full family discussions. There could be some kind of a presentation or skit, and people can talk about it. So it's a way to really talk about some of the family strategies and trials and tribulations. So it could be helping the families have fun together as well. Piece and the professional opinion on these things is key. Okay, so I'm going to talk some about family retreats. So we've done these in Pennsylvania a lot. And I know some other states are doing these. I think they could work. Generally, it's like a weekend, maybe even like a 2-day weekend, with at least like 8 families, sometimes up to 30 or 40 families, with each family having at least one adult and at least one young person, one child. Sometimes it's the grandparent, great-grandparent, or even an uncle or aunt or some other relative who has stepped in to provide the bulk of caregiving. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how these are structured, but generally they serve several functions. Okay, there's a lot of education, there are a lot of sessions. There are some in which you just have adults coming to some space, some part for their own kind of programming. You have some programming for youth. This kind of works well, I think. And then some time and spaces where they all get together, sometimes just families on their own, and sometimes multi-families time. So we'll go through that. And there's definitely a need for people to speak to their peers and support one another and do some stuff that's fun. So for instance, things like rock climbing or some high energy, outward bound kind of activity. You know, I don't want to sound like I'm a stereotyping person, but there aren't many great-grandparents that want to actually get on the mountain and start climbing. So a kid who's really running circles around them and needs to get out and do really energetic physical things, they could really be doing that and enjoying it. And whereby, let's say, the caregiver may have a lot of issues or questions or wanting to figure out how to get a good doctor or a good psychiatrist, you know, how to go about that. Okay, so we're going to keep going here. So some of the things more about retreats. Some of my favorite kinds of activities. The one on the left here deals with family banners. You have each family, and this could happen little time given throughout the 2 days or 2.5 days for the whole retreat to determine what would your family banner be. It could also be a shield, like a family shield, like in ancient Europe. They have these like shields. You think about Scotland. But something like a banner or a shield or something for the family to figure out how to visually articulate what they think is really important or should be important about their family unit. So they make these banners, they spend a lot of time on it, and then towards the end, we would have like a large total group, full camp parade, where each family walks around and they display their banners, let's say, and they present what's on it. And I think in one of the areas in western Pennsylvania, they've done a lot of retreats, and one of the families that's participated a lot, the organizer noted and mentioned to me that the content of the items in the banner have changed. Earlier on, there was a lot of sadness and loss in the family, so a lot of death, and they had like crosses and cemetery images as far as their reason for being together, and part of their identity as a family is that loss, their shared identity. And then over time, they started putting in, images of things that they like to do, of activities that they like to do together, and not really losing the past either, but it was a little bit more looking to the future. And then we have a lot of activities for hangout time, just unscheduled time where people can do fun things. So now, the hangout time is really, really important. A lot of families say that one reason they love the retreats is that so many times they're basically defined as a case number, getting services from human services. So many of these families, the children have multiple diagnoses of problems, psychological disorders, and so on, to address Linda Porter's concern. They say that we don't really have time just to be like a normalized family, that we're not defined according to our needs or whatever, just a chance just to let our hair down and just to relax. So even this pool time, the child looks very, withdrawn. So how are you going to get him to try? And it takes a lot of time and low pressure environment. So there's so much kind of bonding that could take place. You have a whole weekend, you go to a great setting. Here's the setting right, you can't really tell, but it's right on the edge of a lake. So some people love fishing, and fishing is a really good intergenerational activity because there's a lot of time for talking. Oh, and then sometimes you could do a retreat in a different kind of context. So just to share an example, what happened in Pennsylvania, we have this kinship. We've been doing these retreats, and then I'm also doing some work with food and helping families talk about food, work together about food. We have a curriculum called FRIDGE, which stands for Food-Related Intergenerational Discussion Group Experiences. Let's just call it FRIDGE. So we, on one hand, we feel like we're not doing enough of these retreats, so we really wanted to do one, trying to find an opportunity, but how do you fund it? We want to keep it cheap for the families. And then on the other hand, the FRIDGE program was kind of getting old and stale. So we were able to get, and we never did that as a retreat, so we were able to get some funding through Pennsylvania Department of Public Welfare, which is funds through the Pennsylvania Nutrition Education Tracts, which is part of the SNAP program, USDA's Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. So I guess what I'm pointing out is this is an unlikely partnership in a way, an unlikely funding source. It solves problems on both sides. We're trying to develop this family food awareness and partnership and healthier eating initiative. So we have some funding to do that. And then we have families that really could use any kind of a family strengthening experience. So we did a FRIDGE farm retreat. It was like 2 days. It was on a community-supported agriculture farm run by like a religious order in western Pennsylvania. And it was great. And we wove in so many activities related to food and took fresh vegetables and so on from the farm and used that in terms of interactivities. It was really just very powerful, very positive. And it turned out that a lot of these families had severe issues related to cooperation around food and eating and lack of nutrition knowledge, lack of teamwork. So the FRIDGE program was just great. And by the way, all of this stuff is written up on our website. It's free, and I have that at the end, last slide. You could access that. One more of these activities that comes from the FRIDGE curriculum on the right side. It's called Out with the Unhealthy and In with the Healthy. Activities like mobile making. We give them tons of cutouts about all these different cutouts from supermarket sales. And one mobile they make is with food that they want to eat less of. They decide to, and the other mobile is what they want to eat more of. So they cut stuff out. They negotiate. We want more of this, more of that. And of course, we had a nutritionist, a dietitian, extension educator, nutrition educator who's an expert with food, answering their questions. Like somebody said, hey, is it okay that we have some ice cream? Which is a really good question, because sometimes people follow the media and they just messages they think you can't eat anything that's fatty. So you really, the message about balanced diet and so on, and not having to, panic or get anxious about any kind of calories. She could counter that, but after they ask her about it. So it's really a teachable moment. So it's family bonding, it's fun, they're learning, they're doing it together, they're recreating family, they're developing some memories, and also it was on a farm. So of course there are farm-table connection possibilities, but imagine if we're looking at the farm food family connections. So there were just so many ways to bring in conversation and enjoyment along the lines of how we can enjoy food together, spend time together while we eat, shop together, make lists together. So that turned out to be a lot of fun. And they learned a lot of communication skills, which is one of the main goals of the retreat. So we would ask, what did they get? What was the biggest thing they learned from this experience? So people will say these kinds of activities, mostly about how to communicate without highly pressurized judgment, criticism, yelling at each other, and so on. Just about everybody says it felt great not to feel different. I felt like I belonged, everybody understood. I didn't feel judged, which is really very powerful. And just simple things that they find out about things they want to do together. Here's a quote from a child saying, the number one valuable thing I learned was that my grandpa used to like to catch butterflies. So the kid's like smiling. I think he was like 7 years old, missing his 2 front teeth. So a 7-year-old smiling with no front teeth is so cute. And the grandfather smiles in a cute way as well. And he says, and you could be sure he's going to make sure that we do this together when we get home. Then the kid smiled because he's being heard. And they're coming, so of course, I mean, the question of respite, the caregiver does need more respite. But what it needs, especially if there's an emergency need for it, for immediate care and so on, but what the family retreat kind of does, it gives them half respite. It gives them a chance to focus on their own issues, talk to their peers and so on, but then also know that the children that they're caring for are getting messages and learning things that will help them be more cooperative in the family setting. So there are all these adults, all these facilitators helping them have these conversations, helping to depressurize family time. So almost making it easier for them and more enjoyable for them to be caring for children in many cases who are very difficult to care for. All right, well, let me keep going. And then once we start with these creative partnerships, here's a slide that I had for a different presentation. I was very impressed by University of Wisconsin's Grandparents University. They first started with their alumni association and an extension program appealing to alumni, older adults who want to come to campus for some days to do university-type things, like, look at our latest lab, check out our wetlands, and, our new library, eat our food. And then they started saying, I'd love to bring my grandkids. Since they're kind of learning some of this stuff, they would love it. So they tried it. They tried to make it a grand family, like grandparents and grandchildren university. And it worked phenomenally well. So I'm thinking, wouldn't it be great as far as a creative partnership to help, grand families, grandparents and other relatives raising children, to do one of these with a university as a partner, challenging the professors to explain their work in a hands-on way, experiential education way with these families, meanwhile helping them learn together, learn from one another, and learn to appreciate the value of a university education. It's a win-win, and these are kind of connections I think that are waiting to happen, but we really need to be creative and proactive in making these things happen. Okay, so I'm running low on time, so I just threw in a bunch of other activities here. I'm going to start going a little bit quicker. This is from one of our publications, the Intergenerational Activities Sourcebook. So it's online. It's about 90 pages. It has the 50 activities of 50 intergenerational activities. And one of the number one questions I get when people call up, do you have any ideas for things we could do for our church group or, our community center, like an intergenerational activity? So here are some icebreakers that are kind of big hits. I could explain any of these if anybody has a favorite. But people love these, and these could be incorporated into any kind of setting. And it is a good way to start any kind of discussion where you start talking about deeper issues about like feelings and so on. A lot of these families have been through a really rough scenario. So having fun together is great. This slang chart's one of my favorite. You just give a word like police officer or something like that, and then you have them, according to their generational cohort, say the kind of slang words that they used to have for that word when they were young. So, and that's fun. People laugh and they learn about each other as well. All right, and then, exercising together. Here's a family karate studio that to join you have to have a family member. It's in the State College, Pennsylvania, actually, and they offer discounts for grandparents. So everybody's talking about the need to do exercise together. To do exercise, but finding time and motivation is very difficult. So if you ask this grandfather here, how does he feel about exercising, he's going to say, what do you mean? I'm just hanging out with my grandson. We're having great quality family time here. And then dancing, dance downs, music, sing downs, those are great. People love to move, it's healthy, it's good for the soul, it's good for the family. Here's an activity that we've done in Ag Progress Days. I think it works really well for festivals and family room kind of settings. We call it the Stump Your Relative game. You have teams of young people. You could create these boxes yourself, or you could work it with groups of young people and a group of older adults. But basically, you have one big bin filled with items that most young people really know. And then another box bin filled with items that older adults know. And then they try to stump each other. It's a friendly competition. Everybody learns and has fun with that kind of thing. That could fit into a retreat. It could fit in really nicely as a support group activity in which children are invited to. That works. Here's a few more, just some images Melinda sent me. So you see some of the RAPs, the Relatives as Parents groups. They're doing things like intergenerational art day, the PASTA program, second time around, program from Cornell. New York State is just wonderful. They have all sorts of caregiver training programs and family experience type activities, and they keep adding new stuff to it. So I'd encourage you to take a look at their website. And be healthy, be active, right? I mean, so there's all different kinds of ways to do it. Taking hikes together, nature walks, get involved in gardening, get involved in, there's so many things going on, and community groups really need people to be involved. So again, it gets back to creative partnering and trying to, find strategic partnerships that work for creating new activities. Okay, so these families are not isolated, and they're learning what they need to know to thrive. Okay, here we have gardening, we have parties, picnics, and then sometimes you really zero in on a good funding source, some federal, state, or local agency or foundation is realizing how important this is in terms of changing the trajectory of somebody's life, both the caregivers and the youth, understanding the importance of supporting these families so they come up with funds to do important things. And then just a couple of slides. Here's how you could reach Melinda to find out more. I think the website is also listed somewhere here. Melinda Perez Porter. She's been doing this for at least like 20 or more years. So is Jaia. I met her over 20 years ago. I should say we were in diapers. I don't want you to feel like I'm saying that we're old. Okay, and then this is myself. Here's our website. We have all these activities, resources, as Extension does. We put it out. And if you go onto my curricula and activities page, you could access the source book. You could access all kinds of stuff. And I know we have to open it up for conversation, so I'll just leave it on this. I think this is the last page. Yeah. So these are some of the resources I think maybe worth a read. If you're interested in learning more about the support groups and what are best practice ways of setting up support groups, there's Melinda's paper. It's on the E-Extension website. Conducting a family retreat has a guidelines of doing it, written by Nancy Crago, and I supported her in writing this. We have also on E-Extension, there's Doubly Stressed, Triply Blessed. It's a lot of video vignettes and a whole curriculum for doing public awareness presentations to help the professionals who work with grandfamilies and to help them understand what these issues are all about. So you could just grab one of these vignettes, and it's a beautiful way to start a presentation and weave it into your own presentations if you do this kind of work or want to do more of it. An article that Melinda and I wrote here. So it's called Support for Grandfamilies, a Mosaic of Intervention Strategies. So we talk about just about all that's been mentioned here. I think one other piece that hasn't been mentioned is, I guess, what can be called a simulation program. I think it's based on like the poverty simulation type of program. It's developed by Arizona Extension, and we kind of modified it for our use here. But it's a whole program, like a half-a-day program. It could be a full day for professionals, mostly in agencies that deal with a lot of these relative caregivers. And it's meant to show them how almost impossible it is for them to be navigating all these idiosyncratic rules that each agency puts up. Saying you have to get these 4 signatures for all around town. I mean, it kind of shows them how difficult it is, and it's a very effective kind of program to help them be more sensitized and supportive. At any rate, so let me stop here. Just want to lay out some of the exciting things going on, and really just emphasize the support group. And I think the kinship retreat kind of model can go a lot of ways and be used in creative ways. Okay, so I'll open it up for questions.
Thank you, Matt. I very much appreciate your presentation. I think you've given us a lot of food for thought, because most of us think about respite very traditionally as caregiver time away from the care recipient. But I think you definitely demonstrated to us that helping kinship caregiver families build quality family time can be respite for them. So that was a very interesting presentation. We do have one question here, again, from Linda Porter in Washington. She asked to please advise the ways that respite providers can get their foot in the door for providing respite. For example, with Lifespan Respite in Washington State, she's had some difficulty navigating the city system to get to parks and recreation folks, for example, to offer vouchers for camps. How can our Lifespan programs, and I think this is just a good question for both of you, how can our Lifespan Respite programs and our state respite coalitions engage with the right people to make more respite options available for this population?
Well, I should leave this to Jaia, but number one, having like Jaia, Jill, and Melinda spend time with one another and network and be in the same advisory groups is huge. So, I mean, I think the ideas for intersections will come from seeing how these important systems can support one another. Jaia, what do you think?
Yeah, I think, a lot of that comes down to relationship. And it's one of those things that tends to be really specific to the locality. So I think that the person asking the question, perhaps we can individually talk about what people we know in this space there that they might be able to connect with to help with opening that door.
Yeah, sounds good. And just being non-traditional and how you reach out to different people. I mean, Jaia mentioned bowling alleys. I'm thinking movie theaters, museums, supermarkets, community gardens. I think all of you, all parts of the ARCH network and mission have a lot to learn from one another. A lot of the concepts cut across. So it almost makes sense to me that you advertise each other's initiatives and do some networking on behalf of each other as you do your own networking.
Yeah, very good point. If a park avenue is not biting, look at a non-traditional approach is certainly another way.
Are there other? Go ahead. I was just going to pose a question to both of you. This is Jill. Are there other people or individuals that the Lifespan Respite programs or respite coalitions should be inviting to the table to help them plan appropriate respite opportunities and make sure that their voice is being heard at the table around the development of lifespan respite systems? Certainly, I'm glad, Matt, that you represent the Extension Service, because I think that's an excellent partner. That they are engaged in family caregiving issues even beyond the grandparent issues. So I'm hoping, at least in states where extension services are prominent, that our lifespan programs are reaching out to that group of individuals as well.
Oh, on that note, so my role with Extension, so I'm like a statewide specialist. So there are people that I would suggest having a conversation with somebody from USDA who's actually doing family and consumer science programs. and responsible for that. And then we have a whole human development listserv that goes to all the states. I know you know many of these people, but probably most of them you don't know, people who are doing stuff. So I would think to be presenting at one of these NIFA, USDA type conferences, and I could put you in touch. I know that I believe Jaia knows the key people there as well. So yeah, I think that's an important connection, and I think they would also love your network because your work is research-based. I was looking at your website, and I think that's really important for federal agencies to try to promote research-based interventions. So yeah, I think it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and I think I mentioned this before, but if there is a Kinship Navigator program in your community, they're not everywhere, but if they exist, those are going to be key folks to connect with. And then if there is a therapeutic child welfare agency that's providing therapeutic foster care, certainly to have them part of your network would be a way to enhance the partnership there.
Great. One of our attendees said that she works for the extension in Massachusetts, and it would be such a natural fit for partnerships. And another suggests, what about including post-adoption agencies or statewide adoption networks at the table? Would also be an interesting partnership.
Mm-hmm.
I would love to talk with both of them. I see Carrie Bickford with Extension in Massachusetts. I mean, I'd be happy to share with you what we have and learn what you're doing, how we could bring that, out here some more. And Mary Jo, I heard your name from Jill. You're in Pennsylvania too, I understand, and I'd love to find out more about what you're doing and spread the word, at least through like newsletters and stuff through Extension here.
It's also worth calling the National Foster Parent Association to see if they have a state association that might have an appropriate person to participate in the coalition.
Any other questions from folks? Well, once you've disconnected from the webinar and a question comes to you, please feel free to pass it on to us, and we'll ask our new found experts on grand families what they think about your question, and I'm sure they'll be happy to continue to work with us. I did have some questions, too, about accessing the PowerPoint presentations from today. You can actually download them right now from the webinar platform on the right-hand side under Materials. If you click on the last one in the list, Slides, Grand Families, those are the PowerPoint slides for today. We've also included Generations United Grand Families report that Jaia talked about, and the Arch fact sheet on respite for grandparents raising grandchildren. I also wanted to remind all of you that when you disconnect from the webinar, please check your email. You will receive immediately a link to an evaluation of today's webinar, and we really appreciate your feedback and your input. I know some of you had some difficulty with audio. I apologize for that. It may have been due to the severe weather that's happening in North Carolina now, where the webinar is hosted, but I hope that we were able to correct that for you quickly. Without further ado, I want to thank our wonderful presenters again, Jaia and Matt. Thank you so much for taking time from your very busy schedules to present today. The material was really excellent. I know that I learned a lot, updating me on the status of grand families in the U.S. and learning more about respite options that I didn't know about before. So thank you all very much, and we hope to speak to you all on our next Lifespan Respite Grantee Networking call. If you are a grantee or a partner, you'll be receiving information about that call in the next week or so. Thank you all very much. Thanks, Jaia and Matt. And thank you, Emily.
Thank you, Jill.
Thanks, Jill.